Hey guys, this is Jeremy from menzagaming.net, and I'm really excited to be bringing you the first and inaugural episode of Breaking the Meta. Breaking the Meta is going to be a series where I'm going to be doing a variety of videos, trying to release them reasonably frequently. In these videos, I'm going to be examining the most competitive and tactical side of 40k. We all know 40k is an extremely complex game. A lot of us play for fun, a lot of us roll dice and just enjoy kind of the narrative aspect of it, but there are very, very intrinsic, complex elements of 40k that make it very difficult to compare to even games like collectible card games like Magic the Gathering, or even games like chess. Games like chess that have, astounding levels of complexity. Things like chess, you can at least take a very kind of systematic mathematical model and apply that to chess and kind of break it down very mathematically. Warhammer 40k is so complex because it's on a kind of a 3D plane with so many different things going on in any given turn that it's really hard to break down every element and every factor of 40k. And really, everybody will have their own opinion on whether a decision was the right decision, whether the play was the right play to make at any given moment. So that level of complexity is really exciting about 40k. So in these series, I'll be looking at army list reviews. I'll be building my own lists from the ground up and going through the rationale that I employ when I'm building a list. I'll be looking at special tactics and techniques, like things like, for example, looking at multi-assaulting, looking at building Death Stars, analysing different types of shooting units, that type of thing. And following from that, I will be examining specific codices or unit entries. So I might do, a special kind of review of just Death Company and just look at all the ways you can run Death Company and the optimum ways of things like that. This episode, I'm going to be discussing how to build an army in 40k. So given that it's kind of like the first episode, I want it to be quite basic, but just kind of discuss some of the things that I employ when I think about building an army. Obviously, everybody has their own techniques and methods, their own considerations. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it. These are just some concepts that I look at when I'm building an army. So, first things I wanted to say is just that when we're talking, the context that we're discussing for this kind of these armies that we're talking about, generally tournaments that are played in Australia are normally about 1850 points, and I think that's a worldwide convention. Obviously, tournaments can range from anywhere between 1250 to 2000 points, and all of those, different limits have their own kind of factors. But when I'm talking about building lists, I'll generally be assuming an 1850 kind of size. It could be 1750 or 1950, but we're just generally looking at that 1850 limit. The other thing that I'll be keeping in consideration is that tournaments these days are almost exclusively running the ATC mission format, which basically is a format that's molded on the ETC format, which simultaneously uses Maelstrom, Eternal War, and Kill Point types in the one mission. So that means that you'll be drawing Maelstrom cards and trying to capture them. At the end of the game, you'll be trying to sit on objectives for the more points, and you'll also be looking at Kill Point differential to add points as well. So it's a very complex kind of multifaceted type of mission, which I think is really good, and I think it's really good for the game. So to start with, I'm just going to go through some different concepts that when I build an army list, I don't have this list in front of me. This is just something I've just put together now, just to explain some things that I like to think about when I'm building a list. Now, the first thing I do when I'm building a list is I think about pressure units and applying pressure. And pressure is something that it's very difficult to quantify, like how much pressure or what type of pressure things apply. The pressure and aggression is something that in games like poker, where often the person that's got the initiative when betting, aggression is extremely important in that particular game. In chess, aggression can be extremely important, not only because you're putting your opponent in a position where they're reacting to you, but you're also applying psychological pressure. And when you're applying psychological pressure to people via bluffing or re-raises in poker versus things like chess, which is mobilizing opening your board up and putting pressure on different sides of the board, what you're doing is you're allowing your opponent to make mistakes. So pressure is good because not only are you giving yourself a win condition, but you're putting psychological pressure on your opponent. So when we talk about pressure units, we're talking about things like fast-moving Death Stars, or aggressive units, just in general. So things like Death Company with jump packs, Thunderwolf Cavalry, Wolfen in a Land Raider. What else could we talk about? Even things like striking scorpions, sorry, swooping hawks, I meant. Yeah, just units that, or a Harlequin Star. So I've just got a small list like Wraith Knight as well. Basically units that move forward fast, put aggression, relay that aggression really quickly, and basically put your opponent under threat. Now, another type of aggressive pressure unit, they don't have to be combat units. So we could be talking about units that will sit back from midfield and just apply a lot of aggressive pressure through shooting. So it could be units like crisis suits with missile pods or plasma their plasma rifles and stuff that apply reasonable ranged pressure. Crisis suits are a good example. Things like Grav Centurions. What else? Psy cannons. So, like when we say psy cannons, we don't psy cannons in Terminators. So we're thinking about units that can kind of sit midfield, utilize teleportation, deep striking, or like just assault moves to kind of maneuver around, apply a lot of damage from range, and force your opponent to feel like they have to jump away, try and get out of range of that shooting, or feel like they have to come at you and thus expose themselves to other risks. So that's when we're talking about pressure units. Another example of pressure units, they don't have to be a consolidated Death Star type unit. It can be over multiple frontage. So that's when we're talking about things like multiple spoil units of Death Company, multiple spoil units of Praetorians, or crisis suits or whatever. So that's the kind of pressure we're talking about. So psychological and actual in-game pressure. The next thing I like to think about when I'm building a list is backfield support. Now, when I talk about backfield support, I'm generally talking about like objectives that might be in your deployment zone. So when you place objectives, there'll invariably be some in your deployment zone, and holding those objectives, right? So not only for making sure that you're able to capture Maelstrom, but preventing your opponent from capturing those Maelstrom cards, and ultimately, if that objective is one of the eternal objectives, being able to hold that at the end of the game. So backfield support, we're looking for units. When I'm thinking about backfield support, I'm thinking about units that can be cheap. So cheap is good because it means that you can kind of saturate an objective with a couple of cheap units. So we're thinking like, for example, a Razorback with a tactical squad inside it, and then maybe a Devastator squad on the same objective. So that's something you might see in a battle company. So cheap, which allow for redundancy, and sandbagging. So by sandbagging, we just mean you've got 2 or 3 things on the objective. Your opponent has to remove all these different units from that objective if they want to then be able to contest it. It's good if they're objective secured. Objective secured basically means that if your opponent is making a play at your objective for whatever reason, whether it's a last minute capping for Eternal or they pick up a Maelstrom card, objective secured means your opponent's objective secured units can't trump you, and it also means if they happen to try and contest you, that you've still got that objective. So generally, it's kind of prevents opponents obsec trump, which is quite relevant and can be very important. The other thing you want when you've got backfield support is you want relevancy. So things like shooting, being able to shoot, provide warp charge, etc. So, for example, a unit of, just trying to think of a good example, like a unit of Dark Reapers are quite a good backfield support unit because they can sit on an objective. They've got 3-up armor saves. They've got really long range when they're shooting, so you can kind of deliberately place an objective on each side of the battlefield quite far back. You can put your Dark Reapers there. Those Reapers have got a 48-inch range, and they'll be able to support and provide a relevant contribution to the game. So I'm going to type relevant contribution. The other thing you want is effectively something that's quite hardy and difficult to kill. So I'm going to just say hard to dislodge. And when I say hard to dislodge, I mean things that are out of line of sight, like can't draw line of sight to. So small models that can't be seen, units that have good cover saves, that can go to ground. So perfect examples that fit into this hard to dislodge category would be things like Gretchen, Nurglings, Space Marine Scouts with cloaks. Units that are kind of, their models might be crouching, they're hard to be seen, and if they are seen, you can go to ground for really good cover saves. A good test of whether a unit's good for this purpose is if their cover save is, when they go to ground, is significantly better than their armor save. So if you've got a unit that's only got a 5-up armor save, but it can go to ground in a specific context for a 2-up or a 3-up cover save, then you know that you're getting really good value out of that unit in terms of its defensive ability to cap. The last point, and in terms of hard to dislodge, we're also talking about things like that are legitimately tough, or just high toughness. So something like a Necron Heavy Destroyer, a solo Heavy Destroyer, fits this quite well because it's toughness 5, 2 wound, it's got reanimate, 3-up armor save, and it's also quite small and easy to kind of hide, and it's got that assault move as well, so it can come out, shoot, and then go back into its hidden location holding that objective. So you've got a variety of things that you want to look for. The last backfield support consideration would be counterpunch capability. So that basically means that, like, if your opponent is making a play at your backfield, they come at you with a unit that's got some melee capability. They might drop a drop pod, a dreadnought might pop out, might be a unit of tactical marines or stern guard or something like that. You want to have maybe some backfield units that can, in collaboration with each other or on their own, be able to move up, shoot, and then assault that unit and lock it up and prevent it from being a threat and being able to potentially take out your whole backfield on its own. So when we're talking about counterpunch, we're talking about things with reasonable assault, or that can hold up. So Nurglings are another good example because they're generally quite hard to kill. They've got a lot of wounds. But then things just like monstrous creatures and walkers. So things like dreads, dreadnoughts, or dread knights, and also things like riptides. So something like a riptide that's obviously providing really powerful, really relevant backfield shooting for Tau. If a Space Marine army drops a unit of, of Marines, a Stern Guard, and takes a shot at something, a riptide can move up, shoot, and then if there's only 2 or 3 Stern Guard or 4 Stern Guard left, that would normally be a problem. It can assault them and can generally deal with them on its own. So you've got the ability of these counterpunch capability units to just kind of prevent, and like they're just putting out fires in the backfield, and that's what you want them to be able to do. So then the next point that we wanted to discuss would be maneuverable units and objective cappers. And this is kind of like the antithesis of what I've just described. So where we're trying to, with our backfill support, we're basically trying to counter your opponent's maneuverable unit and objective cappers. So with maneuverable units and objective cappers, you're obviously wanting a unit that can, if you draw a certain card, like Ascendancy or Supremacy, where you need to control 3 objectives, or twice as many as your opponent, whatever it is, you want units that can move up for a reasonable movement and put pressure and threaten to capture opponents' objectives that wouldn't be normally that easy to do. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about units that can deep strike, and obviously a bit, accurate deep strike helps. So drop pods, etc. Then we're talking about units that have flat out. So things like Eldar bikes, land speeder storms. What else? Obviously things with assault moves kind of also fit into this. So things like crisis suits. These units generally helps if their objective secured, and these units I've listed all have the capacity to be objective secured. Because it means that, as we discussed above, if your opponent does not have objective secured units on an objective, then you don't have the pressure to have to totally remove that unit. So it just helps that if you can move up flat out onto an objective and capture it, it really can help cycle through Maelstrom cards, which is a very important thing to be doing. So what else? In terms of maneuverable units and objective cappers, also not only for capturing objectives, but perhaps for projecting damage to relevant areas. So projecting damage to like hotspots on the battlefield. So, if there's a certain thing that needs to be able to be killed, having maneuverable units that can kind of all move together and then eliminate that unit is quite good because it allows you to react, allows you to be responsive. To link on from that point, when you're building an army, it doesn't matter what army you're building, whether it's a combat-themed army or an army that might not have the best shooting in its codex, you generally want to at least have some units in your army that have effective shooting. And by effective shooting, we generally mean basically an ability to deal with big threats. So ability to respond Okay, so when we talk about priority threats, in an ideal world, you'd want your army to just be able to obliterate your whole opponent's whole army in shooting in one turn. But it's not realistic. And in a realistic context, your opponent will be making plays at you. They'll be moving units. They'll be doing things in their turn. And often when they do their things at the end of their turn, there are 1 or 2 units that are a priority threat to you. There might be 1 or 2 units that are threatening to roll up your flank to basically achieve really good efficiency by destroying multiple of your units. They might have put a unit in a position to get a multi-assault. They might have a unit that's on an objective that you know you want to get next turn. Having these priority threats, having the ability to deal with them from shooting is extremely valuable because often these priority threat units are robust in combat. So being able to just kind of put that fire out quickly and just not have to worry about it is really important. So when we talk about effective shooting, we're talking about the ability to respond to priority threats through kind of long range so that unit can apply its anti kind of threat capability over multiple frontages at the same time. We're also looking for relevant weapon types. So you want things that often the highest priority threats have quite good armor saves, so 2-up and 3-up armor saves. So you could say the most extreme things would be Death Stars or units that have ICs in them with 2-up saves or just units that have 2-up saves across the board. So you kind of want AP2. So when you've got an army, when you're looking at the army shooting, you generally want to have some AP2 capability in that army. Some armies just don't really have a great amount of AP2. A great example of that is something like Tau. Tau struggle with AP2. So even when you're building a Tau army, things like Riptides with ion accelerators or broadsides with plasma guns on them, which you might not be feeling like you're taking the optimal loadouts in certain respects, but having the ability to project some AP2 shooting is quite important. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about having effective shooting. And also things like being able to open up certain vehicles, open up dreadnoughts, basically allow your army to deal with priority threats. The next things are, I'll try to be a bit quicker with these ones. Efficiency. So efficiency just basically means good points efficiency, right? So in certain codexes, you'll have certain entries, unit entries that are just really good. They just kind of synergize, all their stats work together. They're just a good type of unit. So when you're talking about going into your codex and you kind of isolate the power plays in the codex, the efficient units, obviously stacking those units is a good way to build a good army. So you're kind of looking at your codex's strengths, and you're also kind of creating synergies as well. So an example would be something like, I'll try and pick an example that lots of people might kind of know of. Let's say look at quite a polarizing army like Blood Angels. Blood Angels are pretty low tier, and a lot of people kind of feel like Blood Angels aren't that strong in the metagame. But if you look through the Blood Angels army, you'll see a lot of just subpar choices. Like Blood Angel Scouts are just inferior to normal Space Marine Scouts now. Blood Angels Dreadnoughts have less attacks than normal Space Marine Dreadnoughts. You're looking through this list and you're not really finding much that pulls at your attention. But you might come across the Sanguinary Guard unit entry. And Sanguinary Guard, while they are quite expensive, are a pretty efficient unit. They come with a power weapon, they come with 2-up save, and they're fast. So you might look at Sanguinary Guard and feel like that's a relatively efficient unit, and I think it is. So when you're creating a Blood Angel army, you kind of want to be including choices within the list that are efficient choices. So once you kind of commit to a unit like Sanguinary Guard, then look for other ways to increase its efficiency. So you might say, like, if taking Sanguinary Guard, which are already efficient, add a Sang Priest. And that's not necessarily the most novel or revolutionary kind of idea, but the idea is you look at something that's efficient and you look for other ways to boost that unit's efficiency. So that's just what you're trying to do in terms of, and this is probably one of the most fundamental elements of building a list, and this is what people do intuitively. So I'm not going to spend too much talking about this particular point because it's kind of obvious that you look for efficient choices. The next point regarding, it's kind of like relating to efficiency, is utility. And utility, when we talk about utility, we're just talking about a unit's ability to provide value over multiple different roles. So capability of filling multiple roles, has options, diverse range of. So things that have utility are units and unit types that have different options. So you might look at something like a broadside. A broadside is an expensive unit, but it's got incredible, not broadside, Riptide. Riptide has incredible utility because it's got its different abilities to overcharge. It's generated to do lots of different things. So if it needs to be able to move a long way, it can. If it needs to be really survival, it can. If it needs to provide more shooting, it can. And Riptides can also have like early warning overdrive and other things that give it just utility to be able to give anti-deep strike, value as well. So you're looking at things that have the ability to do lots of things at the same time. So while a Riptide is a particularly good example, these kind of types of units with good utility exist in codexes. So a unit with utility might be, say, we're talking about a unit of Black Templars, Crusader Marines in a drop pod. And that's a really fluffy unit. But a unit of Crusaders in a drop pod that might have close combat bolt pistol with a melter gun and a combi melter dropping down. That's a unit that, while it might not be the most efficient unit, so it might not have the highest efficiency, it's got good utility because it's got the ability to provide threats to your opponent over multiple types of modes or mediums. So it's threatening armor through its melters. Once it drops, it's a unit of Marines with combat ability. So it's kind of, and it can drop on any kind of part of the battlefield. So it's got options, right? So when we're talking about utility, we're just talking about options and the ability to just answer multiple threats as they're needed. So they're the kind of things I just wanted to discuss when you're building a list. You're kind of looking at units and looking at things that create synergies that hit all of these points. The last thing I wanted to just quickly go through are archetypes. And when you're creating an army, are you going to adhere to an archetype and why? So the first archetype I wanted to discuss was Death Stars. And combat Death Stars are a really powerful kind of archetype because, just once again, as I discussed, they're very high pressure. They're normally fast and apply pressure quickly. So sometimes they scout forward, sometimes they just have really, really good movement, they can flat out, etc. So they're providing like the threat very often of a turn 2 charge. What basically makes combat Death Stars a thing, what makes them, basically facilitates them being a top tier option, is the multi-assault capability and mixed armor saves. So when we're talking about multi-assault, obviously we know that when a unit, if you have a really expensive unit like a 1,000-point Death Star that could only move and assault one unit at a time, it would be really constrained by that and would potentially take, you could just feed it units and it would just never get its value back. But because it can multi-assault and maximize use its large frontage and its large footprint of units, it generally allows it to recoup its value. So its survivability is often its strong point as well through mixing armor saves, which basically means you're just taking different defensive loadouts, putting them in the same unit so that you can use whatever defensive stat you need against a certain type of shooting that's coming at you. So if you have a unit of Wolfen that's being, you've got like a Lord with a 2-up armor save and a Storm Shield tanking for the unit of Wolfen. What you're doing is you're taking a unit that's really good offensively, and then you're saying, if you shoot my unit of Wolfen, I'm going to be able to take 2-up saves. Because normally I wouldn't be able to take 2-up saves in those Wolfen because I've got a 4-up armor save, but now I can take 2-ups because I've got my Lord there. And then you might say, well, the way to deal with that particular Lord would be to throw, ID wounds on him so that he doesn't get the full usage of all of his wounds and all of his 2-up saves. So then you might take an Eternal Warrior Lord and have an Eternal Warrior Storm Shield Lord in the unit as well. So that you take your kind of chaff 2-up saves on the Wolf Lord, then anything that needs to be tanked that might ID him, you put onto your lookouts are onto your Eternal Warrior Lord. So what you're doing is you're just maximizing your survivability through Lookout Sir. So something like if Lookout Sir was changed to not be a 2-up and she was changed to a 4-up, that would just destroy a lot of combat Death Stars because you wouldn't get the reliability of tanking. Similarly to combat Death Stars, shooting Death Stars is when you will just take a massive unit that's got really good shooting and then use that unit as a hub to project shooting over the battlefield. So what facilitates shooting Death Stars is the ability to be mobile. So often it's through things like Gate of Infinity, sorry. Assault moves, or maybe deep striking via drop pod. So moving fast, being able to be mobile, and then often having some sort of split fire capacity. So very rarely will you see a shooting Death Star that doesn't have split fire. So the split fire might be through things like like an Omniscope for Centurions or target locks for Tau crisis suits. It can also be through the psychic phase. So you could take a unit that doesn't have any actual split fire, but put a few psychers in that unit, and by having a psychic projection, it allows you to cast psychic spells, because psychic spells aren't constrained by the single target rule. So you can psychic shriek multiple units with your psychers, use different type of maledictions and things to project force over a multiple frontage with that psychic star. So I'm going to put psychic in there as well, because that kind of does facilitate those long range Death Stars. And of course these Death Stars also make use of mixed armor saves. The next type of archetype would be the MSU archetype. And MSU was something that was coined on Druchi.net about 15 years ago. Can't remember the author's name, but he wrote a really, really long article about using multiple spore units. And in Warhammer Fantasy at the time, it was almost an unheard of paradigm. And from there, it kind of snowballed, and it kind of became just a colloquial term within just almost gaming overall. Actually, it actually went into different mediums as well. So MSU is something that a lot of people kind of just talk about it. They don't know exactly what they're just talking about, but they're talking about just saturating multiple spore units. And when you saturate multiple spore units, what you're doing is you've got redundancy. And by redundancy, it means if they kill your first melter drop, if you've got one melter drop that might mishap, it doesn't matter because you've got another melter drop. So you've got lots of things happening that basically mean that if something goes wrong with your first option, you've got backup options with the same ability. So redundancy. So they spell redundancy. The next thing that's quite important with MSU is overkill. Maximizing, minimizing, overkill. So when we talk about that, when you've got small units, in a perfect world for shooting, when you're the aggressor, it would be great if you could shoot every model on its own, because it would basically mean that you never had any overkill, because as soon as that last model died from an opponent's unit, you would start allocating hits elsewhere. So when you have big units of shooters or whatever, and you're shooting something, very often your opponent might only have 7 or 8 models left in their unit, but you roll a bunch of dice and you kill 15 models. And you've just realized that you've lost. You might have rolled really well, but you've just lost a bunch of shooting that could have actually flowed over and killed enemy models. So by having MSU, it basically means that you're shooting small little volleys. And by shooting small volleys at a time, you're minimizing your overkill that you're achieving on your opponent. And likewise, by having lots of small units, your opponents will achieve overkill on you. So they might shoot you with a bunch of plasma guns, and they'll shoot a unit of 5 Death Company with jump packs, but they'll inflict 8 deaths on you. So if you had a unit of 10 Death Company with jump packs, you would have lost 8 of them. But because you only had 5, sure, you lost your whole unit, but you effectively saved 3 Death Company. You gained 3 Death Company worth of value through that. So that's a really important concept. It's just efficiency of shooting, and maximizing and minimizing overkill is a really strong element of MSU. Of course, just board control and having ability to project over lots of areas. So just board control and projection is a really important part of MSU. Of course, MSU has weaknesses. So I'll just quickly just write their biggest weakness would just be kill points. Kill point vulnerability. So, if you've got a ton of small units, they're easy to kill. Your opponent will almost always get the full kill point differential on you. So that's something to keep in mind. So while MSU is quite a strong archetype and it's something you can employ even in a list with a Death Star, like you could have a Death Star as your basis and then have MSU for the rest of your army, just be careful. While MSU has a lot of benefits, it also has the kill point vulnerability. And the other vulnerability is that it is easier to force morale checks. So if you've got a bunch of small units, your opponent might saturate morale checks on you. And while they might not have eliminated a whole unit, they'll force you to take morale checks, which not only can allow them to capture certain Maelstrom cards, but it can just let them get cheap value by you running off the board. So they are some weaknesses of MSU. Similarly, MSU Assault is just basically the same as shooting, except, with MSU Assault, you're looking for all of the above. Like, that's all these things that apply as well. But other considerations would just be you want fast stuff. You want, and you want stuff that can deal with a variety of threats. So within your, assaulting wave of tide of units you're throwing forward, you want to have AP2 mixed in, anti-vehicle mixed in. So you want to be able to deal with threats. While you might be saturating a single platform, you might have lots of Death Company, you might have lots of Thunderwolf Cavalry, whatever. You want to be able to deal with things across the board. So it might mean if you've got units of White Scars bikes, putting melter bombs on the sergeants, taking some melter guns in units and stuff, just giving yourself the capacity to deal with threats that you wouldn't otherwise be able to deal with. When you're building lists, the next thing to think about is defensive platform stacking. And basically that concept just means that you're taking one type of defensive stat. So where that defensive stat might be power armor, it might be Terminator armor, it might be no armor, just taking a tide of stuff. And if you're taking like a crap ton of Orc Boys with 6-up saves, then you're effectively giving your opponent no value out of their AP2 or AP3 shooting. Their AP2 guns effectively become AP6 guns. So what you're doing is, regardless of what type of saturation you're doing, you're creating inefficiency that might not have theoretically existed in your opponent's army. Your opponent might have a really good army, but by stacking a defensive platform, you're actually creating inefficiency in their list because their last cannons might have nothing to shoot at. If you've got no vehicles at all and just a ton of bodies, your opponent won't be able to get any value out of their anti-tank weapons or their AP2 stuff. And likewise, if you have a ton of 2-up saves, sure, your opponent might have had that one plasma drop to deal with your unit of Terminators, but if you've got 5 more units of Terminators, then you'll eliminate those plasma guns after they drop, and then your opponent won't have a way to deal with your Terminators. So you're then creating a rolling advantage. So platform stacking can exist through things like spamming a certain armor type, or excluding certain things. So it might be just not taking vehicles or only taking vehicles, things like that. The other kind of like a popular type of defensive platform stacking is rather than stacking armor saves, stack toughness values. So, so a good faction that can do this would be Necrons. Necrons have a lot of abilities to get 3-up save toughness 5 models that all have reanimate. So things like Tomb Blades, Destroyers, Praetorians, Lich Guard, their lords. Like you can literally create a whole army, notwithstanding their troop choices, that are all toughness 5, which means that when people are looking down at strength 3 and strength 4 weapons, they start to look a lot worse and a lot more shabby when you're only really targeting toughness 5. So that's definitely something to look at. Like if you've got, for example, an army and you've taken this army of Astra Militarum, you've got all these infantry, you've got a bunch of tanks. Maybe you shouldn't take that one unit with really good armor saves. Might be, Bullgrins or something that you wanted to take that had a really good armor save, or that one really high AV tank. So if you've got a bunch of AV12 tanks, kind of Chimera equivalent chassis, maybe you shouldn't take that one AV14 tank, because we know that all your opponent's melter is going to go into the AV4 tank. So there's a kind of merit to just creating redundancy and avoiding giving your opponents really easy decisions for where they put their shooting. The last thing about when you're creating a list, obviously, just kind of goes against what we've kind of been discussing here, is just obviously balance. You don't have to take a list that you only stack the same platform. You don't have to take a list that has a Death Star in it. Like, at the end of the day, there is a lot of merit to taking a balanced army. And when we take a balanced army, often you've got a bit like a large, or we'll say a large toolbox. When you've got an army that's got lots of tools to deal with lots of different things, it makes it quite easy for a good player to play well. If you've got access to all the things you need to deal with certain problems, you very rarely will play a game where you feel like, oh, I just lost that game because I couldn't deal with that one unit that he had. So you've got a large toolbox when you're playing a balanced army. You're also, you basically just allows for reliability. And this is something that, probably isn't spoken enough about. If you've got an army that's really balanced and you've kind of comfortable to play it in a lot of contexts, you can get really experienced with playing that army. So it's something that kind of fosters a sense of experience and lots of games played. So if you've got a really kind of polarized list, like one day you say, I'm gonna try an 11 drop pod army, and you start playing that, you'll very likely get bored of that 11 drop pod army very quickly. Or it might be an army you take specifically for a certain tournament. And then for the next tournament, you might feel like you really want to take this mech list where you just, you're spamming out AV14 vehicles with, like Lemon Rust vehicles or whatever. But these are armies that very often will just be taken as a flavor of the month, or because you think they're really good in a specific context. And because of that, you might just not have the experience with that army, and you might make basic mistakes. Whereas when you're playing a balanced army that you're able to tune over time, you will be able to gain experience with that army and be able to basically win matchups that a less experienced player would not have won. So it allows for tuning and just growing with your list. So despite what I've said here with a lot of these kind of very important polarized kind of like styles, like the benefits of MSU, the benefits of Death Stars, at the end of the day, there's a lot to be said for running a balanced army and learning and growing with it. Anyway, guys, I hope you've been able to get something out of some of the things I've been saying. If there's any kind of concept I touched on that you'd like to hear more about, I want to have a chat about, feel free to post in the comments, and I'll get back to you if I can. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll definitely be working on some more coming up. Some of the other contributors at Mensa as well are going to be working on videos like this, and we're really just trying to stimulate discussion, stimulate strategy within the community. We know that 40k is a really intense strategic game. Like, we know that there's definitely room there for players that really love getting into the competitive side of gaming to really let their juices flow and really have fun with each other. So take it easy, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you.